Hello and welcome to the
I watched in Russian.
in my opinion, one of the best. Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal Horizon podcast. It is my great pleasure today to talk to Stefan Auer of the University of Hong Kong. Now, this is going to be a little bit odd because, Stefan, you are in Hong Kong and you're also an expert on Europe and the European Union. So if it is okay with you, could you introduce yourself a little bit to our viewers and listeners and maybe talk a little bit about the career path you took in the past?
Yes, well, I have taught European studies at the University of Hong Kong for the last 11 years. Prior to that, I lived in Australia, but I did my PhD also in Australia, actually, at the University of Melbourne. And the very first job I had was at University College Dublin. But I'm originally from Czechoslovakia, a country that no longer exists. So I should clarify, it's the Slovak Republic. Today, I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia. I emigrated to West Germany, what used to be West Germany. I studied literature, philosophy, and education at the University of Cologne. But then I moved to Australia and I did my PhD in political science at the University of Melbourne. And I have studied and followed Europe from Europe's peripheries, right? Slovakia, Ireland, but then also from afar, from Melbourne and from Hong Kong.
Stefan, you have written a book that was published in 2022 with the title European Disunion. And I think in many ways you kind of anticipated things that would be happen within European integration. At the time of us recording this conversation, it's Monday, June 2nd. We just got the final vote count of the presidential elections in Poland. It looks as if the conservative candidate or the candidate of the Law and Justice Party has edged out a close victory, but a victory nonetheless. So if you would look back at what inspired you to write your book and at the things that are currently happening in Europe, what is your assessment? Do you think that the main thesis of your books held up quite well, or would you write things differently if you would do it again?
No, very much so. And I want to thank you for your kind invitation to this podcast, because I reread the concluding chapter and I felt vindicated. The concluding chapter talks about 2020 as the annus horribly, as a horrible year for Europe, because that was the moment of pandemic. It was, the end of Brexit negotiations. The Eurozone crisis is still not gone in my view. So I looked at a series of crises that have really undermined European unity and also exposed Europe's dysfunction. So the traditional story that made its way in all textbooks about European integration is that through crisis, Europe grows stronger, right? And my sense was, as I was writing on this book, working on this book, that the series of crises that Europe has experienced over the last 10, 15 years didn't work that way, that they really disempowered nation states and democracies at the member states, nation states level, while there was no adequate power created at the European level. So rather than strengthening democracy in Europe, it resulted in weakening democracy in Europe, but also it resulted in diminishing Europe's ability, or Europeans' ability, at both nation-state level and supranational level, to deal with pressing problems of our times. And I wrote most of the book prior to the Russian aggression, full-blown aggression against Ukraine. But I just looked at the concluding remarks, and I also have a chapter there on Russia and Ukraine. So I consider that a major threat. And I suppose the gist of the book is that Europe did work fairly well in times that were not as challenging as the times that we have witnessed over the last 10, 15 years. So in good times, that project of European Union, European integration seemed to have worked well. But in challenging times, when you need to make tough decisions, right, the idea of having a post-political, post-national polity has just not worked. So that's why I draw on this controversial legal political theorist Carl Schmitt, who argues that sovereign is the one who decides on the exception. And Europeans believed that they were beyond these kind of problems or beyond these kind of descriptions of sovereignty, but we are not, right? There are so many difficult decisions that politics need to make that might decide on their very survival. And that's why that project that was meant to unite Europe and bring the nations of Europe closer together seems to be pushing them further apart from each other.
So, in a sense, Europe or the European Union is a fair weather project. If things are going well, it works. But if there are crises formatting or on the horizon, it doesn't. It seems a bit as if one uses the old Francis Fukuyama line, that the European Union is not so much the embodiment of the end of history, but it depends on the end of history. In a sense, as you just said, that in a peaceful world, a world dominated by commerce, by a focus on economic growth, it appears to work. But at a time of crisis, at a time of global tensions, not so much. And also drawing on what you just said about Carl Schmitt. So in your view, who is the sovereign in Europe, or who thinks they are the sovereign, and who do you think is actually the sovereign?
Yes, excellent. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Francis Fukuyama, because I mean, that essay and then a book that followed is one of the most cited, right, academic writings in my lifetime, for sure. And Fukuyama was onto something. He really captured the moment. But for me, the funny thing is that while for academics, right, I mean, their whole library is now disproving Fukuyama's claim from early on, immediately after the publication, right, of the end of the history. And you know, the article appeared in the spring of 89, before actually the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. So Fukuyama was a visionary in many ways, right? But while in academic literature you would see most people making fun of that claim, I think that in policy circles, and particularly in Europe, basically most policymakers adopted that viewpoint, right? That we live in this post-conflictual work where as Martin David Jones described it, you could achieve peace through conversation. And Martin David Jones ridiculed Habermas's concept of communicative reason, right? That you really can get over all conflict if you just talk to each other for long enough. You know, we will sort out an optimal solution. We won't be fighting against each other. So that world no longer exists. It might never have existed, right? The illusion existed that world existed in the time of the Cold War, where the US basically confronted and contained the Soviet Empire, and then in that unipolar moment after the collapse of communism between 89 91, right? But as I said, over the last 10-15 years, it's becoming more and more obvious that conflicts are here to stay, and that politicians need to make difficult decisions and decide on alliances, you know, and that polities need to show that they are able to defend themselves, right? And that is one thing where the European Union was always even conceived of as a kind of incomplete project, right? And in times where, as we see in Ukraine, you know, you need people committed enough to that polity to fight for it, to kill for it, to die for it. If you don't have that, you don't have a nation, you don't have a state, right? I mean, that is to me one of the great paradoxes of the war that Russia wages against Ukraine, that it was predicated, the aggression was predicated on Putin's idea that Ukraine is not a real nation. And in the process of waging that war, Putin actually disproved his own hypothesis, right? Because whatever the eventual outcome of the war is going to be, to me, there is no doubt that the war showed that Ukrainians are very capable of defending themselves, right? It is a true political community, a true nation, in the way that Europe is not. And that is one story I unpack there, and more in concluding, kind of in the author's note that I was able to write after the beginning of the war, that there is almost a craving on the part of EU political elites to adopt Ukrainian nationalism as a European nationalism of sorts. But I think that attempt is ridiculous, but also dangerous and counterproductive, right? Europe is not capable of creating the kind of sovereignty that we think of in relation to sovereign nation states that are capable, able, and willing to defend their very existence. Because for that, you need the kind of attachment of citizens to the polity, and you need the kind of attachment that amounts to their willingness to fight for their polity, right? So Ursula von der Leyen never stops praising Ukrainians, that they fight for Europe, they are willing to die for Europe. I think that's a misconception. They're fighting for their nation, they're fighting for their families, they're fighting for their very survival. They see their survival in the context of European integration, but they're not fighting for the EU, frankly.
If we tie a little bit together what you just said, also going back to your point about Habermas, I mean, this is one of the key problems, right? The idea that there are no real differences, there are no differences in values, or as you said, attachments to different nations, different interpretations of history. There are just misunderstandings, if you want, that we can resolve through communication, and that there is ultimately, I might stretching the Habermas context a little bit, but this idea there is only one solution, or there is only one reasonable approach to almost every problem. And if we just are willingly go into the conversation, we can reach that one reasonable outcome. But as you, of course, just described this, what do you do if we stick for a second with the Russian-Ukrainian issue, when you have one country that perceives the other country as being integral to its own history and thereby almost has to be part of their own polity, as you said, right? Denying the existence of an independent Ukrainian ethnicity and independent Ukrainian nation. And then, of course, you have the Ukrainian perspective, which I know that exists. Like, those two things can most likely not be solved via a compromise because they're mutually exclusive. And I think what you also said, which is very interesting, a point I would love you to elaborate a little bit on, because I think that is so crucial. This Habermasian postmodern world has left a gaping hole, if you want, in the soul of Western Europe or the member states of the European Union, where in the past there was nationalism, religion, a commitment to one's ethnic heritage, you name it. And now there is this odd idea, which I'm so glad that you said this, because I feel that many commentators have not really realized this idea that now Ukrainian nationalism can fill that hole, that you say, sure, we are German, we are French, we are, we are, you name it. And even though we are not really nationalistic about our country, we can now be nationalistic in the Ukrainian sense instead. So this is also philosophically and culturally a very interesting phenomenon that we see unfolding here.
Yeah, I agree with just about everything you said. I mean, of course, scholars of Habermas would tell us that we are not doing justice to his sophisticated theory. I mean, I would also probably disagree. Habermas is not someone who advocates some kind of postmodern predicament, right? He is really attempting to revive one strand within the Enlightenment. So he's a modern philosopher. But just one kind of vignette to illustrate your point, where I think we are in complete agreement about fundamentally kind of apolitical approach to politics that, to my mind, Habermas represents. That I think that just a couple of years ago, maybe in 2022 even, at the moment that war in Europe again, started with Russia invading Ukraine, there was a new edition published either 40 or 50 years after the first appearance of the Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, right, which is one of the key Habermas's work, and there is a new introduction there written by Habermas, and he does not mention war even once, right? So it is really, he theorizes a world, as you described it, in which there are no fundamental differences, right? I mean, that is even where I think Trump fundamentally misjudged the enormity of the challenge that anyone has who wants to truly kind of bring about peace between Russia and Ukraine. Because as you pointed out, tragically, for both sides, they think of it as a fight for their very survival, right? I think that Russians are utterly misguided in that assumption, but I can't deny that is how they see it. They see an independent Ukraine as a mortal threat to their very existence as a national community. And not all Russians see it in that way, obviously, but I suspect the significant majority that continues to support Putin sees it in that way. And that is in the nature of the political, that not only people like Carl Schmitt, who was a despicable human being, right? I want to put it on the record, a brilliant mind, a brilliant political thinker, legal thinker. But it wasn't just Carl Schmitt. You look at Hannah Arendt, you look at Max Weber. I've been reading Thomas Mann more recently. It's quite interesting that a number of German intellectuals, right, writing between the wars, had a far richer and I think more accurate understanding of the political than most German elites have today. It's understandable why they disown that political theory. You know, I I respect the fact that many German scholars or thinkers, commentators don't want to go anywhere near Carl Schmitt, but I believe that there is a lot there that we can learn from. And I think of myself as a liberal, as a conservative liberal, perhaps. And I think that we can only tackle the problems that we face by gaining a proper understanding, right, of the nature of the political. And for that, I draw on Carl Schmitt, on Hannah Arendt, on Max Weber, or even Thomas Mann, whoever helps me to understand what's going on. And one of the key driving forces of politics is indeed conflict. And sometimes this conflict escalates, it becomes mortal, or it's at least perceived as a conflict for the very survival of the nation, right? Denying that is what drives politics doesn't create a peaceful world. Actually, it makes the nation that adopts that posture simply more vulnerable, right? And this is where the current development is very interesting, because systematically, in many ways, Europe has disempowered itself, and now there is a lot of talk about sovereignty or an attempt to rearm Germany, rearm Europe. But I remain skeptical about how much can be achieved, because it's not just about spending more money. You need to change people's attitude, right? And there is a recent book that just came out in Germany, right? That is
Yes.
2 or 3 years after my book was
Yeah.
published. I make exactly that point, right? That people are not even willing to fight for their own nation. So of course, no one is going to fight for Europe. And I think while this is the case,
And
Europe is
that's
not
the
a polity.
that's the thing, right? There's this idea in to look at it from two perspectives. I think one is we have been very much spoiled by the autopilot of global politics in the 1990s. I mean, there were issues on the quote unquote fringes of the map. You had the wars in the Balkans. You had the economic collapses. You had issues in Asia. You had the collapse in Russia. So not everything was great. But if you lived in Western Europe, and I would say even starting in the mid 90s in the former members of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czechoslovakia, or then the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, life was actually pretty good. I mean, I think you can always see it in the movies and the TV shows. Like
Yes,
they were utterly unpolitical because
yes,
there was not a lot going on politically. I would even argue, maybe if we want to, we can go into this a little bit more, but that's up to your choice if you want to. I think even the so-called phenomenon of wokeness is almost a backlash against the quote unquote boredom of the 1990s. Right? There's if we stick to the Schmittian analogy, is that without anything that resembles a friend and an enemy, it might be comfortable, but it's also very, very boring. And an
boring. And
argument that
actually, you might recall that the final paragraph of Fukuyama's essay, and there are various versions, right? Because he first wrote a short opinion piece, then he wrote an essay, and the book is actually much more nuanced and sophisticated. And the book came out, I think, in 91. But the essay that he wrote in the spring of 89, actually, the final paragraph talks about this, that at the end of history people just get bored, and that's
yeah.
how history will restart. And the madness of wokeness is, yes, I mean, but you see, that is another aspect that I try to tackle in book in the book, and I feel vindicated also looking now at the elections, right, that just took place, presidential elections in Poland, that to my mind, the backlash against European integration, against globalization, right, in the US, is to a large extent not so much a success of conservative alternative elites, but the utter failure of the pro-European liberal elites, right? A failure to connect with the electorate, the failure to understand the needs of the people, right? Because what is walking is that instead of considering the very real material needs of traditional voters of social democrats, for example, right? The agenda shifts towards identity politics, and I personally actually would respect any number of those issues like gender equality. I think it's very worthwhile agenda, right? But it just went completely overboard, right? I do not think that. I mean, for me, it's really absurd to watch how some of those agendas are then, how attempts are made to impose some of those agendas on countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which I know fairly well. I grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, so the idea that there would be a majority of Slovaks or Poles or Czechs in favor of I don't know how many dozens of genders or whatnot. It's a complete non-starter, and it's not even helpful to any of those constituencies that might advocate this, right? Because all that it creates is more resentment towards it, right? So,
But
in those areas, surely you need developments within nation states, within viable communities that might change attitude towards I don't know same-sex marriage or whatnot. But you can't have it imposed by EU. So of course, most of my pro-EU colleagues would say that EU is not imposing anything on anyone, but you and me know that there are ways for the EU to pursue these agendas, and yeah. So increasingly, I think for pro-Western, pro-EU liberals, closeness to the EU becomes a liability. I think this is what we have just seen in Poland, where the candidate who just won the elections, right? The candidate for peace, the conservative candidate, from what I understand, he wasn't even that hugely popular, that many people voted against the government and their progressive candidate, right? So again, it's a backlash, basically.
I mean, do you think one of the issues that you just alluded to is that we are in many parts of the West in an almost unresolvable dilemma? So one is there is this lack of existential struggle, which to some degree or another is an important part of the human experience, or has been at least in the past, also from an evolutionary perspective, if you want, right? That life consists of risk, of danger, that you stand your ground in the face of danger. But then on the other hand, of course, there is also the seductiveness of comfort, which is that even though you know psychologically you would like to be part of an existential struggle, but at the same time, you really don't want to lose the comforts that a world without existential struggle is offering you. I mean, the book by the German author, I think is a very, very young man that you just showed, right? Which is, it's titled, "I would never die for Germany. I would never fight for Germany," is exactly this, that on the one hand, you reject this idea as almost absurd that dying for something metaphysical is worthwhile. But of course, on the other hand, there is this nagging feeling, and this reflects what you said about the European Union's attitude, or the European Union's elite's attitudes towards Ukraine. There is this nagging feeling that something is missing. I mean, there is in fact another title by a Habermas essay, right? The sense that something is missing. There is whether it's in religion but this kind of metaphysical, these invisible ties that also tie community together. You see this, sometimes I find it almost a funny way, when you have debates about patriotism in the United Kingdom, and people are asked, so what keeps the UK together? And very often they say, well, there's the NHS, right, the National Health Service. Or even in Germany, it's the welfare state, which I think is a very almost crude reduction of what community is supposed to be, or what community was in the past, to say, oh, it's the welfare system, it's the pension system. That's all very nice, but to go back to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, is anybody really willing to die for the NHS? Is anybody really willing to die for the German pension system? And I think
Yeah.
that that is not the case.
I mean, yeah, I have to admit, I feel uneasy about this conversation, and I'm actually sympathetic to Ole Nimoyen, right? I am not, I am not going to volunteer to die for any country or any idea, right?
I
So
don't think I would. Yeah.
this ambivalence that you described, and I found actually large parts of this book convincing. He is a very accomplished writer. He draws on Bertolt Brecht, and he is someone who believes that his government, the German government, doesn't legitimately kind of represent his interests, so he doesn't owe it anything, etc. But the problem remains, and honestly, as you just pointed out, there seems to be almost like craving. I mean, there is probably no politician who went to Kiev more often than Ursula von der Leyen, right?
Yeah.
And I went to Lviv once a year and a half ago, and that was a very interesting learning experience. And I feel very privileged. I was able to talk to locals, etc. And it's quite a challenging trip, even in terms of basic logistics, right? You can't just fly over to Kiev. So that's quite a sacrifice, but it also probably reflects that craving, as you pointed out, that you want to face some serious challenges and risks. I mean, going to Kiev, right, during the war, but yeah, also as you pointed out, this ambivalence that at the same time we all value our comfort, and who are we? Like, we are sitting comfortably in our offices in perfect safety. But what do you say about the political community? I have in my concluding remarks, no amount of money, multilateral cooperation, deployment of military force, or effort of non-governmental organizations can create a political community where there is none, right? This is the meaning of Schmidt's famous dictum that the very existence of the state presupposes the concept of the political, right? And now, of course, with the EU, it gets complicated because no one ever claimed that the EU is a state, right? That is again also a textbook wisdom, that the EU is an experimental polity, right? It can do many things, but not everything that the state does. But there are two things to it. And that is, one is, and that is what I observed over the last 10, 15 years, that the EU has been taking more and more roles that were traditionally fulfilled by states, right? And that tendency has been dramatically kind of accelerated and intensified since the Russian aggression against Ukraine, were not me, but leading EU figures, Borrell, who was the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policies, like, he promised to Ukrainians, like 3 days after the outbreak of the war, he promised to Ukrainians that EU will send them fighter jets and whatnot, right? So they gesture as if they were in charge of a functioning state with an army and whatnot. And that I found enormously irresponsible. Like, in times of war, you can't make outlandish claims like that to your partner and then not being able to deliver on that. So the EU is not that kind of polity. Some people would say, well, it never claimed to be. But these days, of course, when Macron talks about a sovereign Europe, right? What does he mean, right? That is also actually quite revealing that until recently, no one would dare to talk about sovereignty, right? Because EU was a response to the problem of sovereignty, right? We want to move away from Hobbes and all these old-fashioned political theories who thought of sovereignty. But so these days, then they deploy that term, but God only knows what it means. We know that in the case of France, sovereignty basically means a Europe that is ruled by France. And that can be illustrated by the way in which Macron did and did not offer to extend nuclear umbrella across Europe, to kind of Europeanize a French nuclear deterrent. Because he made it very clear that it would remain a French deterrent, right? So it would be in the hands of the French president to decide on the exception, right? So then you have even a formalized way in which Europe is, at least in that aspect, right, military affairs, ultimately ruled by France, which It's not going to work for other nation states of Europe, right? However
Do, do you
attractive that might be.
do you think if we touch back a little bit on what you said at the beginning of the conversation, right, that the European Union works well during good times, but not so well during crisis? Do you see a risk or a potential for old European enmities re-emerging? I was listening. We just mentioned the elections in Poland, and I try to follow politics in Poland as close as I can. Crossing the language barrier and everything. But there is a sense that even though there is a lot of celebration now on the European right, that hooray, the right-wing candidate won, and it's another triumph for the European MAGA version, and you have it. But once the dust settles and you take a closer look at this, I mean, Polish nationalism still is, maybe not as bad as it was in the past, but is still by tendency antagonistic towards Germany. It's antagonistic for good reasons. Again, I'm not saying there are no reasons for it. This is an observation. It's an acknowledgement, not advocacy for it. The same is true with their relationship to Russia. So do you think there is a chance, if the European project, in whichever way, shape, or form, should fail, and European Union and European member states are starting to go their own way again, that you end up in a situation where, for example, the Germans will say, listen, kind of Poland has behaved so antagonistically towards us. They constantly talk about the Fourth Reich and that we owe them reparations and whatnot, that we now reach out to the Russians because the European Union is basically dead. The United States have retreated and are so far away. And in the past, German-Russian cooperation has worked better than German-Russian antagonistic behavior, and then Poland once again will be squeezed between the Russians and the Germans in almost a repetition of European history as it happened 200-300 years ago. And we really are at the restarting of history then. Or do you think that's too far-fetched?
No, I think that threat is very real, and one of the paradoxes that I try to discuss in the book and have been thinking about ever since is that I think that I don't know whether it's too much to say that it's almost a tragedy of European integration.
Yes.
That it is now pushing those nations of Europe or turning them against each other. And with respect to the most recent presidential elections in Poland, the striking thing was, and I saw this reported in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is not certainly siding with conservative candidate there, but they pointed out that even Tusk used anti-German rhetoric in trying to garner more support for his candidate, right? And then conversely, though, Friedrich Merz, for whom I have respect, particularly in his position on Russia, I think a more kind of powerful posture that he tries to adopt is laudable, but he didn't help his cause when he threatened very recently Slovakia and Hungary with cutting EU funds if they don't support his position on Russia, and so I'm in a strange position because I support his position on Russia, and I think that Fico is a disaster. Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, is a disaster for Slovakia, but he represents sovereign interests of the Slovak Republic, and under current EU constitutional order, EU treaties, right, foreign and security policies require unanimity. So what Merz is threatening is actually even incompatible with the EU's constitutional order. But that obviously increases suspicion and hostility towards Germany, even in Slovakia or Hungary, countries that are not as hostile actually traditionally towards Germany. So that is the paradox, right? That the project of European integration, in my view, and that's what I discuss in the book, it went ahead too fast, too far, and it has resulted in more disunion in pushing the nations of Europe further apart from each other. But Europeans do need some organization that brings them together, especially even in relation to Russia, as you pointed out. So, but I think it is understood also in the conservative camp in Poland. My friend Marek Cichocki has been making this point for decades, that it is vital for Poland to enlist Germany, to gain Germany's support for important issues, also in relation, for example, to Ukraine and Russia. But the kind of EU hubris doesn't help. So, for example, I am very pro-Ukrainian, but I'm not disturbed by the fact that the new Polish president is not that supportive of Ukraine's membership in the EU, because that project was probably never going to work anyway. Ukraine needs European support for its very survival, but it is not obvious to me that for that survival needs to become a full member of the European Union. It needs military support, right? And it needs other kinds of support, even economic support, but not necessarily EU membership. And my understanding is that the new Polish president is very robustly anti-Putin. I don't want to say anti-Russian because none of us are, but he will stand up against Russian aggression. So I think that's a good outcome. That is where I am not. That would be a different discussion to have. But Fico's position on Russia I find indefensible. Orban's position I can at least understand. I think is a pragmatic attempt to stay somewhere in between. But Fico appears to be openly siding with Putin's Russia, which I find indefensible and not in the strategic interest of the Slovak Republic.
And there is, I think you touched on one of the big, another one of the big paradoxes of the European Union at the moment, which is that instead of trying to consolidate the achievements and to say, okay, we have now grown to a certain size, we have about 27, let's look what's happening with the Balkans, maybe in the near future 28, 29 member states, but now we really have to consolidate and fix the processes and also get exactly what you described, get public opinion back on our side. So to make this a project that has the commitment and the affection of a majority of the people. But it appears that the solution to the problem is compounding the problem. So there is already talk about that now we're going to accept Moldova, and then we're going to accept Ukraine, and then we are going to accept Georgia in the European Union. And I don't think there is a stomach among the peoples of Europe, from Portugal to Poland, to extend these memberships. And I have to quite frankly ask the question, that's as a final question. Now, as you move from Central Europe further towards the east, I mean, you enter a territory that is in a kind of netherworld, if you want. I mean, it's a nightmare for the people themselves. It's like a form of purgatory. They are not really Asian, but they're also not, I would say, European in the traditional sense. I would say that has always been the big problem with Russia, right? That it's a country that is neither fully here nor there. And that is partially true, I would say, for Ukraine. It's definitely true for Georgia. And this is not a disparagement of the people, not at all. But it is just that the historical ties, that's, let's say, tie Germans, Austrians, and Poles, or Austrians and Slovaks and Czechs together, that does not exist with the Republic of Georgia. That does, you can say it exists a little bit with Western Ukraine, Lviv, Lemberg, these areas. But even there, it's already somewhat problematic. And to then declare these nations as being, the obvious candidate for European membership, and even Cyprus, I think, which is an EU member, falls a little bit into this category and is slightly problematic. So instead of consolidating in order to save the project, it appears that by trying to expand it even further, you might be accelerating the potential, which I think nobody's really hoping for. It's more that some do, but I like you, I would rather fear it, could potentially accelerate the disintegration of the European Union.
Well, this is the irony there. And I mean, you have a saying in German, right? Der Weg ist das Ziel, right?
Yes.
The path itself is the goal, and that sounds very poetic, and it's applicable to many areas of our lives. But for the EU, this is now becoming a liability, and there have been various attempts to discuss the end goal of European integration, finalité, right? They use that German term, and they stay away from it because once you start spelling out what the end goal should be, the different positions become clearer. And again, it's a source of further division. But there is one irony or paradox that I would like to point out or highlight, that I actually would be open to the idea that Ukraine should become a member, or even Georgia, right? And
Yeah.
I don't want to go into these civilizational debates like, for me, Dostoevsky is a profoundly European thinker and writer, as much as is, I don't know, Thomas Mann or Milan Kundera. So there is no fundamental reason there not to think that Russia too one day could be thought of as a part of Europe. But the basic paradox there is that the way Ukraine is and is going to be for decades to come is completely incompatible with the way in which EU elites Europe is and ought to be, right? This concept of a post-national Europe is far further away from Ukraine than even Poland ruled by law and justice party, or Orban's Hungary. Like they have lost so many lives fighting for their sovereign nation, right? So the idea that that same Ukraine would be happy then with some, post-national polity in which their nation state becomes member state that is just one of many voices that's all, that has to accept Brussels ways of doing things. I think that's completely unrealistic and undesirable. So yes, the EU could enlarge dramatically, but not the kind of EU that we currently have, and certainly not the kind of EU that is de facto being created, not the kind of EU that German or French leaders imagine we should have, right? We need a more modest Europe. Funnily enough, I concluded my concluding chapter by citing Donald Tusk, right? Who is basically the biggest loser of the elections in Poland, because I think that most analysts say that his candidate didn't succeed because of people feeling that the government underperformed, didn't deliver on its promises. But on Europe, he himself said Europeans must depart from utopian dreams, right? That less would be more. But I don't see that happening. I mean, even in relation to Ukraine, or especially in relation to Ukraine, that there is continuously an enormous gap between the ambition and the promises that are repeatedly made and Europe's capabilities, right? And that's damaging to the credibility of the European project, that is damaging to democracy in Europe. And I think it is also damaging to Ukraine in its fight for its very survival.
Well, on that note, Stefan Auer, I thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you on the show again in the future.
Thank you.